seconds. The live streaming needs a minute.
I'm just setting things up so that I can still see the chat and the Q&A. I see a hand up. Do you have a question? Is that a residual from Jacob's presentation, or do you have a question now?
Mercedes?
It's residual, I'm sorry.
No, no worries. Just wanted to make sure. Linnell, is the live stream?
Yeah, it's up. It's running.
Oh, okay.
All right.
Shall we get started? All right. So yeah, everything's all good on your end, Linnell?
Yep.
Great. Okay, Lauren, shall we?
Yeah.
All right. Okay, well, I hope you all got to catch your breath, enjoy that quick break. But welcome to the Writing a Statement of Purpose workshop. So my name is Stephen. I know I introduced myself briefly earlier, but I'm a physics grad student at Harvard. I'm in my 5th year right now, and I study renewable energy through computational methods. And again, I was a physics and math major at the University of Rochester before this, and I am really honored to be here and to share this talk with you. And my sincerest wish is that this information can be useful to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren. I think I also introduced myself earlier, but I'm also a physics graduate student at Harvard, also in my 5th year, and I study pattern formation through analytical and computational methods. I'm also honored to be here, and I echo Stephen completely. Yeah, so for the next hour, we're just going to be talking about how to craft your statement of purpose, which is maybe one of the most crucial parts of your graduate application, no matter what field you're going into.
Yeah, and Lauren, feel free to do the thing where you take control of my screen if you need to click.
Yep.
But yeah, so first off, Dr. Berendez touched on this earlier in the previous presentation. But we're going to start with just commenting on what a statement of purpose is. So whereas your college admissions essay, can be many things, and they can all have very different formats and flavors, it can be an opportunity to tell a story about yourself or show off your creativity or share with the admissions committee a slice of the world that you came from. The graduate school statement of purpose, by contrast, is a much more focused and specialized document.
And so your SOP, it needs to tell the admissions committee everything they need to know about your potential as a researcher, as a scientific researcher. And so this needs to be supported with your prior academic research experience, an explanation of your interests also as a PhD student and beyond, and both how you fit into the program that you're applying to and how the program is going to benefit you as a promising young scientist.
And just as a statement of purpose has a more narrow scope and focus, it's also expected that it'll be slightly on the shorter side. So typically these run only 1 to 2 pages, 2 pages absolute max. And one thing we'd like to impart with this presentation is that even though the research statement has formulaic components, every essay, of course, will be slightly different, just like each and every story is slightly different. So we expect for the 50 active participants in this workshop, there'll be 50 different sort of ways that you can kind of chart your own path. And hopefully we can provide a framework for you to tell your story as best you can as an up-and-coming scientist. So now that you know sort of the basic what of an SOP, we'll comment briefly on what your goal is with the SOP. So the goal is to frame your path to graduate school in a way that best conveys your promise as a researcher. And so if that sounds like, oh man, how do I go about showing that? Please don't worry. You're still at an early stage of your career, and your interest and enthusiasm is a large part of your qualification for graduate school. And so your performance in your coursework, as well as whatever research experience that you've gained in the run up to grad school, is plenty to talk about. And so we found it kind of inspiring just to look at the Harvard mission statement for their Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, where they say that their goal is to identify, not necessarily the most accomplished or the most published or the ones from the most well-credentialed schools or the ones with the highest grades, but it's about just the most promising students. And that promise can take many, many different forms.
So the big thing to keep in mind throughout writing your SOP is that you have to know your audience, because your writing is always going to be the most effective when you have a clear message to your audience in mind. And so here you actually have an advantage because you know exactly who the people are who are going to be reading this statement. They are going to be research professors, they're going to be at a university, and they're going to be looking for people to join their research group as graduate students. And even more broadly than that, just a little bit, is to join their field as a young scientist. And so this kind of goal should be in the back of your head with every line that you write in your statement of purpose.
So try to write your statement of purpose with a formal tone and try to keep the focus overall on your research. Remember, as you write and rewrite, you should look at every line and ask yourself, is this, making the case? Is this making the argument as to, if I would be a valuable researcher in someone's group? Because that question will be at the forefront of your reader's mind as they read your statement of purpose alongside the rest of your graduate school application.
So some other things to keep in mind while you're writing your statement of purpose. I guess one of the big things is that you need to focus on your research, because this statement is foremost about you as a scientific researcher and your potential in that specific endeavor. And so this is something that is actually kind of hard to overemphasize. Your statement needs to be laser focused on this goal. And actually, in some ways, this kind of makes your job easier because you all have already done the hard part. You've gone to lab, worked late hours, written simulations, worked to understand really difficult theorems. And so use the statement of purpose to basically just take ownership of these accomplishments. That being said, it doesn't mean you should just rattle off a list of all the projects you did and courses and papers, because most of those are already elsewhere in your application. So really the statement of purpose is meant to kind of weave all of these experiences together to demonstrate your larger scientific trajectory, how they challenged you, inspired you, how they shaped you as a researcher and informed what you want to do in the future. And finally, of course, you also have to keep this connection with your very specific audience in mind at a particular institution. So your general appeal as a graduate student, it may apply very broadly to many different schools, many different fields of study even. But it will still, your statement will still be the most effective if you can make the case that, okay, this specific institution will be the best match for both of you, and that you're going to excel not just as a graduate student, as an individual, but also as a graduate student in their school or their department. And so this does mean that you will need to personalize your statement at least a little bit for every institution that you apply to.
So, and again, this, this emphasis on research doesn't necessarily mean that your SOP has to be a totally dry exposition of the scientific details of everything you did, but it is the one place in your application where you can tie in your own personal experiences. So the rest of your application has, things that are kind of at the time of application, a little bit outside of your control, like letters of recommendation or like GPA or your GRE scores. Your SOP has a unique role because it's the one place where you can contextualize your story as an applicant, as well as the material, like alongside the materials in the rest of your application. And we will have lots of practical advice later in this presentation about how you want to include things like that. So basically, the principle is you won't go wrong if any personal detail you introduce, you kind of tie back to your overall objective of making the case as to why you'll be a great graduate student. So for instance, if you're a first generation college student or the first in your family to go to graduate school, like there's like a very sound connection to what that says for your tenacity as a scientist. And, like perseverance and tenacity, that's a very important part of being a PhD student. And professors will recognize that and appreciate that. So now we're going to, we said we'd give you some examples. We're going to walk through first the ingredients of a successful statement of purpose. So here are the terms and the formula, if you will. And then afterwards, we'll give examples for each of those ingredients.
So usually at the beginning of your statement of purpose, although it's not always the case, somewhere in there, you're going to have a succinct explanation of why you want to go to graduate school. And often this will actually be in the context of what you want to do after graduate school. And so many of us want to be professors at research universities. You can say that and briefly explain why. If you want to go and get a PhD to get research training for industrial research or science policy, you can also say that as well.
Secondly, everything you've done that is related to research in your undergraduate years should be represented in your statement of purpose. So if you've done a summer or two or more of research or like worked in a lab during the semester, that's great. And definitely make sure that you include it. You can also include more intensive work that is sort of like research adjacent, such as if you had like a very extensive class project that required you to investigate some problem in detail, or perhaps if you've had internships that required you to work independently.
And we all know that being scientists, it's not just long hours at the lab all day, even though that's a big part of it. But other things that you've done that are related to science, such as outreach or teaching or technical internships, these are also perfectly good accomplishments to mention in your statement of purpose to go back to your main goal. And about these personal circumstances. So as we mentioned earlier, the SOP, it's your chance to provide context to your undergraduate career. And so there isn't a lot of room once you've answered most of the other things. Most of it's going to be spent on your research background. But we do recommend allowing maybe for a couple of sentences to discuss any personal circumstances that you might want to address, other aspects of your application that you kind of want to cushion a little bit. And so this could involve many different things. Maybe you had some unexplained time off during or after college. Maybe you had some personal circumstances that just meant your GPA was down for a semester, like an undiagnosed medical issue, or if you changed majors like very late into your undergraduate career, this kind of thing. And so communicating this to total strangers can be a really delicate process, but later on we're going to go through some strategies to do this so that you can put yourself in the best light as an applicant.
And as Jacob mentioned earlier, it doesn't hurt to tailor some small part of your statement of purpose to an individual university department. So if you know that there are certain professors that you might like to work with, or a particular facility or apparatus at a given department that would be integral to your research there, definitely say so. And so actually, I mean, it's kind of funny, but if you name an individual professor, there is a high chance that one of them will end up reading your application. And so we got a question in the chat about what is a good place within the SOP to address personal circumstances. So we'll give an example or two later about how you might want to approach that. I don't know if it could make sense to either put it up front or near the end of your story. But we'll talk about sort of some practical advice about how you can talk about personal circumstances as well later on that may help to give some clarity as to what makes the most sense for you when you address it in your own SOP.
And we will discuss imposter syndrome toward the end of this talk.
I could quickly answer that question, actually. So when I was writing my statement, because I was also in a similar position, what I did was put it like towards the end, but in a way such that you end up leaving the statement sort of in a very positive light. So you want to kind of like build yourself up like as this like, you know, really great person because you're already like great. So you're emphasizing how great you are. You're just lightly recognizing that you might have had some circumstances that you know, may have affected maybe your GPA or your GRE, and we'll see examples of that later. But you have to immediately follow that with making sure that you also remind them of how great you are currently as well. You don't want to completely end on like, you know, what your circumstance is, but you also don't want to start with that either because you need time to build yourself up. So build yourself up, briefly mention it, and then get back to why you're so awesome for their program.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and again, yeah, we'll have some advice too about how to, like, because this imposter syndrome thing, like, it's hard for me too. Like, I know that, like, you know, it's not fun to talk about yourself, you know, sometimes, like, it's like a little uncomfortable knowing exactly how to do that. But we have some strategies for that we'll touch on later. Thank you for the question. But yeah, so, oh yeah, and also just another quick ingredient / formula, you know, component of the SOP is that this general outline will probably apply to every institution's requested statement of purpose, but just make sure that you read the exact phrasing of the prompt. And if they ask for certain information, like absolutely answer those questions. So, I mean, not providing the information that the application like specifically requested, it could be read by, again, you know, somebody who's read like 100 of them already and is, you know, thinking about getting to lunch. They may read it as like not taking the application seriously. And so it only takes 5 minutes just to double check the prompt and make sure you've covered everything they asked for. And this can take different flavors. Like some institutions will ask that you have your research statement and your personal statement be sort of separated. So stuff like that. Yeah, so now, whoops. We will walk through some of these successful statements, some statements of purpose that were part of successful applications to graduate school, and we'll demonstrate each of these points in action. Lauren.
All right, so the first bit of why you want to go to graduate school in the first place, this is a 1-paragraph answer to the first point. And this was, as Stephen said, the very first paragraph of a successful SOP that got them into a Harvard PhD program. And it begins boldly, literally and figuratively. I want to conduct research and train the next generation of scientists as a professor at a research university. And the student then goes on to explain their very first experience with research in high school and what they took away from it, how it informed their interest in pursuing the scientific career. And so note also how this bold statement is also backed up immediately with a brief, but also very punchy explanation about how the author's first experience, their first research experience, informed their broader goals. It's clear, it's simple, and it's down to earth. And this bold font also of the first sentence was also in the original SOP. That's how it was formatted. And we'll touch more on these formatting tips later. But one thing you can kind of notice is that it really affects how you read this paragraph. This is the headline. This is what they should take away from this paragraph.
Mm-hmm. It's in one line. It really is almost like this is like a statement of purpose. Like it's just like, oh, this is what I want to do. So after you explain why you want to go to graduate school, it's time to talk about your research background. So here's a really nice example of a paragraph explaining a student's involvement in a research experience. So to walk through, my research was conducted under the guidance of blank and the dynamics of the lipid membrane. So from the very first line, we know who guided the research and what the research was about. Okay, so that's the who and the what. So then next, we learn what the goal of the research was, which was understand the parameters, effective rigidity and rotational motion of our phospholipid monolayer. And after that, after we are told what the goal, we know what the research was, we know what the goal was, and now we are told immediately about the results of the research. So, we able to find that increased pressure, there's an overall reduction in rotational motion in our lipid monolayer. And so what ends the paragraph is the punchline is that it led to a peer-reviewed publication. And so remember, we're writing to the audience here. So, maybe if you were talking to your friend, like, oh, how was your summer research? It was like, yeah, no, we ended up getting a paper out of it. Like, that may feel like sort of like humble braggy to sort of drop it in that way. But this is, the SOP is a written job interview. And so, you are talking to a professor who you are trying to convince to hire you. And so absolutely don't be shy. Putting the spotlight, as Lauren said, with the bolding. So this bolding was also in the original essay as well. This is not our emphasis. A deliverable like this is what the professors are going to be interested in hearing, right? Like, oh, like how, what's like a surefire way to know the research was a success? It's like, oh, we got a paper out of it.
So here's just another example, because you're probably going to have about 3 to 5 paragraphs of your research background. It's going to be the real meat of your statement of purpose. And so again, we see this kind of similar structure. We're told upfront who the researcher worked with, and then we learned about what the question was, what it focused on. They were trying to make this mobile platform for this technique to identify components and see whether they could do that with a phone camera. And then they told us exactly what they did, what their work entailed on a daily basis. They designed 3D printed parts, they wrote code, they trained other people on these concepts. And so you can see that it's succinct, but it's also not terse. And it's also formal, but it's not that jargony either. This is kind of another point we'll come back to later on. And also note that in this research experience, unlike the previous one, so this project did not result in a paper, which is fine. In fact, that's probably the norm for undergraduates applying to PhD programs. You may have no papers, and that's totally fine. That again, it's the norm.
That's the average case. Sorry, Lauren, but yeah.
Yeah. And also, but furthermore, not every successful research venture just by itself has to end in a paper. And so what the student listed in this paragraph is already a pretty impressive list of accomplishments just by itself. And we gather that, okay, the student, they can work independently and they can work collaboratively. They have experience with design and fabrication. They can write code. These are all useful skills, again, for their goal, for the job that they're applying for, so to speak, that they can take to their new research group.
Yeah, so just to briefly comment, so in the chat, is mentioned, right, like it's a little pressuring to think of this as a job interview, but remember, at least you have, like, maybe that is like kind of like that might put a little pressure on this, but remember that, like, unlike a job interview where you only get one take, with this, you get to rewrite you get to spend as much time as you need. You can ask for help from whomever you need, and you get to present you get to figure out, study, analyze, and then execute the best version of yourself that you can put forward. And so you have like a home field advantage here, because you are talking about your story and you are the expert in that. And so you can take as much time as you need to make it as positive as possible. So another question is about, does it matter if you're the 4th or greater author on a paper? No, you were a co-author on the paper. That is how you talk about it. Like you absolutely, there are, as the way one of my professors put this to me when I asked a similar question long ago, is there are no losers on a winning team. Like you were a part of a successful scientific enterprise, own it. You contributed something to that work. And so absolutely mention that, absolutely.
And also really quick to another question in the chat, how can you use a research experience where the results were not so fancy or ideal, but it was still an important part of working in this research experience? That is what the admissions committee wants to know. They want to know that you can go in and do the work, and they also know that it's not quite as glamorous as, you know, it may sound, but it's still a very, very important part of being a successful researcher, because, you know, that's the truth. You're going to have to work through a lot of non-ideal results, non-ideal months in lab. And if you can demonstrate that, you know, you can do that, that's what they're hiring you for.
Okay, so let's, so we will talk, so there, okay, so two quick questions. So one is, if you have a first authored paper, does that set you apart? In a word, yes, completely, absolutely, 100%. That's a great thing, own that, put that front and center. Do not let them miss that in your application. The next, so two similar questions. What if you're working on writing up a paper, but it's not published yet? Yes, absolutely. And we'll talk a bit about that later, about how you might want to bring that up. And papers and prep, yep, same thing. Absolutely, do it. Yeah. Yeah, and you can, yeah, whenever you mention it, you can sort of briefly comment on the status of the manuscript. Yeah, no, these are, I mean, honestly, these are just excellent questions, because yeah, they're honestly like, they're preempting the entire, this is great. These questions coming, we're all on the same page here. This is fantastic. Yeah, so again, we mentioned briefly earlier, you can talk about other highlights of your other science related accomplishments. And so here you can talk a bit about your commitment to serving the broader scientific community. So for instance, in this paragraph, the student chose to talk about how they took time to volunteer at a local elementary school. So efforts like these are nice because they evidence your passion for science, as well as your ability to balance multifaceted commitments. And we said earlier that we talk about ways in which you can discuss parts of your background that may not necessarily come through in the raw numbers, like, you know, what is the story behind your transcript or your GRE or your change of major, et cetera. And so this example, we thought was a particularly skillful way of addressing that question. And so let's look through it closely together. So you see that the first two sentences here succinctly state the problem. Transition from college to high school was difficult. My math and science preparation was incomplete, and my time was limited due to work study obligations. So the problem was, you know, preparation was incomplete, and the reason why, you know, it continued to be an issue in college was because the applicant didn't have very much time because they were working. So then after that, though, the rest of the paragraph is about how the applicant sort of like worked to overcome this barrier. So we learned that the student was, is dedicated to the solution to the clearly stated problem. So the student was able to complete their degree of physics and then try to improve their background even further by enrolling in an intermediate graduate program. We're then told about that, about that next step. We're told that the efforts were resounding success. And also pay attention to the rhetoric of this paragraph, because I think this was very clever. That, what gets bolded, the parts where the applicant turned it around. Like this is, the success story is what is bolded. Maybe we can sort of glean that perhaps, the academic performance in the beginning of college maybe wasn't as strong or as reflective of the applicant as they were applying. But we don't see that number. We don't see the undergrad GPA. We don't learn about how their performance was in that semester. What gets bolded and included, the number that somebody is going to remember, is 3.92. And that's a great GPA by any standard. That's the one that gets left with the reader. So again, this is echoing what Linnell said earlier. It's like you want to build your, when you're talking about difficulties, you want to still build yourself up in the way that you address them. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later as well.
Okay, so these are the main ingredients of your SOP, or like kind of the skeleton. And we've highlighted a bunch of these great paragraphs that you also saw not just their content, but also their style. They were formal, but they were also simple and direct. And so just to kind of drive this point home and highlight some of these finer details of like working within every sentence of your SOP, the kind of rhetorical strategies you might want to use within one paragraph. We're going to go through rewriting a sample paragraph. This is from real life, based on a true story.
Yes, that's right. So here is a sample paragraph. In summer 2018, I did an RU at U Rochester. This was a great experience and I learned a lot about atomic physics. I had never had experience with numerical simulations before, so we weren't able to finish the project while I was there. We eventually want to publish it. Coding was a lot of fun and I want to continue doing this in grad school. So what went right here? I mean, because this paragraph has, there's some positive points here. So we learned that it was a good experience for the applicant. We learned that it informed, we can gather that it informed their interest in atomic physics and that they want to continue in this direction when they go to graduate school. We also learned that it was their first, we're getting some sense of how this fits into the story. We learned it was their first experience with numerical simulations and that even though there isn't a paper yet, we get the sense that one is forthcoming and it's on the way. And that it was ultimately, in terms of tying back to persuading a professor, like here's how I'm going to be as a grad student, we get the sense that it is formative for their future research directions. So now let's loop through some of the things that could be done better. So first of all, we don't know who the student worked for. That we know where they were, but there's a lot of labs there. So we don't necessarily know. The PI might know, like fields are small enough. And so it's good to mention who you worked for because the scientific world is actually, it's like kind of disturbingly small. And that odds are people within your field may know the person in question. I mean, they may even be friends, which is great. What was actually done that summer? It is nice to know that the experience was a positive one, but we don't know from this paragraph what they worked on while they were there. Now, if you talk about what skills you've acquired and what projects you worked on in particular detail, that can give the professors a clearer picture about what projects you might be suitable to be hired for. So they might read it and think like, oh, I actually have a very similar project that's starting in my lab. This might be good for them. Next, both of these statements can be empirically true, that it was the applicant's first time working with numerical simulations, first time for everything, and that the project wasn't completed with the bounds of the summer. Also, I mean, that happens. That's in fact, I'd say the average case. But there's no need to phrase it quite like this. Saying that you frame it as that like I had never had experience with something before strikes an almost apologetic tone. It's like, oh, my experience was not there before. And that there's no need to say that necessarily you weren't able to finish the project or like you weren't able to, especially if you still have plans to carry through and finish it, which is what the next sentence suggests. And remember to keep your writing style as formal as possible. Common abbreviations and colloquialisms like U Rochester or instead of University of Rochester are using a sort of conversational tone. Abbreviations like grad school, which everyone knows what that means, that might detract from the formality of your presentation. So now we're going to look through and correct some of these sort of these areas with identified room for improvement and see how it adjusts the overall gestalt of this paragraph. So we can see who the applicant worked for and what was done in the group. So we learned, oh, okay, it was Nick Bigelow and it was numerical simulations of Bose-Einstein condensates. Okay, cool. So now that's a clear sense of what the project is. So a clearer who, where, and what. Next, whether or not the applicant hasn't worked with numerics before, again, part of the story, but we replaced it, that adds a little more to the argument about why this applicant is a good researcher. So instead of talking about how the paper wasn't finished, we emphasize that we had preliminary results. And remember, guys, what are preliminary results? It can be as simple as a test figure, like a single figure that shows oh, my experiment is taking basic data, or oh, I have the first draft of my simulation. That's a preliminary result. You can own it like that, and you should. And then, so we learned that, we sort of pivot smoothly into, oh, we have preliminary results, and we're going to keep collaborating on the work, and we're going to finish it. We're going to complete a manuscript for this. So this, now I've just touched up the, also I see a lot of questions. I think Lauren is dealing with them, but we can also pause at the end of this to take just to make sure we get all of them. Just tightening up the formality of the tone. So again, University of instead of U Rochester. And then also finally, we bring back in the fact that this was the first time with atomic physics, but we mentioned it at the end of the paragraph in a sort of looking forward section. So it's like, we'll move smoothly from this into the stated intent explicitly to continue working on similar stuff in grad school. So I'll leave these two up, just so you can kind of see the difference in the overall effect of reading both paragraphs. And now I'm just going to look briefly at the chat, which is humming.
One thing I'll note is also, these are, again, really, really great questions.
Yeah.
But also, as Stephen said in the beginning, everybody's SOP is going to be different. Everybody's experience is different. And so that's one of the great things about tomorrow and Monday, where, we can give you individualized feedback on your statements of purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes there's one way to handle a situation. Sometimes there's another way, kind of depending just on who you are and what the situation is.
Yeah, no, I think, no, not a silly question at all. How is an SOP, how does it do more than what a CV does? So, I mean, just in the same way that the SOP has like kind of a standard like formula, CVs also have a super narrow scope about what a CV is supposed to look like. So as a result, like that form washes out a lot of details. CVs are just like, oh, I worked here at this date from this, like this date to this date, this date to this date. They don't have narrative summaries of like, oh, first I did atomic physics, but then I realized I wanted to do plasma physics more. And so now I'm doing that. Or, oh, I had some experience with microbiome, but now I'm full on the theoretical chemistry chain. Like, so the SOP, it's almost, I don't know if this is a good analogy, but maybe like the between like reading the notes versus hearing the music. Like your SOP is going to be sort of the narrative about your story as a researcher, and then how it motivates all of those experiences sort of come together to sort of make you want to go to graduate school. So it's almost like, let's say that CV is like flour, water, eggs, batter, and then the SOP is cake,
You should include all of your research and experiences that are informing your decision.
Yeah, I think
is generally better if you can, just because they contribute to this picture that you are a versatile and dedicated scientist.
I would also say, and this is maybe part of like the personalization, I would try to put the spotlight on and maybe spend the most time and sort of like rhetorical weight on those that are the most like indicative of what you want to do in the future, or that like are most closely tied to what you did in the future. And even if you like learned things from previous fields, or previous projects you worked on, you don't need, you can talk about like, not necessarily how they informed your research interests, but maybe more like what you learned. Like, I mean, this is something that I did. Like I talked about how like in one project, I it's not what I ultimately ended up doing in grad school, but like, oh, I learned a lot about working on a team and how like organization was important, because like I was like working on a code base that then other people would use. And so even though it's not like what I wanted to do in the future, I was like, okay, here's what I took away from that project, and here's how it led me to the next opportunity. Again, yeah, good question. Yeah, and so again, maybe you can think of this as oh, come on, click. Yeah, it's kind of like the tiny brain versus galaxy brain version of. And remember, it's the same experience here. It's just all in how you frame it can create a very different impression. So this is again, yeah, like this. You have the time to polish things and make sure you have your best foot forward.
Okay, so we're just going to talk about a few more general tips for writing your statement of purpose. And thank you for all these questions.
Yeah. Or I can take these in chat if that works for you, Laura.
Okay, yeah. If you can go to the next slide. Okay, so we talked earlier about formatting, and this can actually play a huge role in the way that your SOP is read. And keep in mind, again, that the admissions committees that are reading your application, they're going to be reading hundreds of other applications within a very short span of time. This is something professors love to complain about. It's true, it's a stressful time. And so the more straightforward your statement is for them to read, the more they will be able to hear of what you're trying to say. And so just do not send them a wall of text, rookie mistake, break it up at least into paragraphs, and you can even use extra line breaks. Just add a little bit of extra space between paragraphs that maybe touch on different aspects of your application. so that, they can kind of see the structure of your statement of purpose and they won't get lost halfway through. It should also be rhetorically straightforward. This is not a great place for extended metaphors or anything that can require rereading. You want to make your points simple and direct and back them up with any supporting details immediately. And finally, usually there will be pretty loose formatting guidelines for when you go to submit your statement of purpose, and you can use this to your advantage by just adding tasteful things that will help your reader's eye. And so you saw earlier, we had these bold sentences that, okay, this is the key takeaway of this paragraph. You can also consider things like using section headings or maybe some numbered lists, as long as, again, this is a formal document, but if it makes it easier for the admissions committee to read, I think that's only a good thing. Okay, and now so coming back to this discussion about dealing with what we're going to call red flags. So again, the statement of purpose is a place where you get to tell the story. And so, it may be the case that you have red flags in your application. I certainly did. I think Stephen also did. And that's okay. The people reading your application, they understand that the path to graduate school and as a scientist, it contains many twists and turns. All of our circumstances can be very different. One thing is, do not just ignore them and hope that the admissions committee won't see them. They definitely will. And if you don't take the time to address them, the committee is going to just assume the worst. And so instead, use your agency that you have here. So even if you had a rough patch during your undergraduate experience, you don't necessarily need to dwell on that fact. Instead, you can use this opportunity and give yourself credit for how you dealt with the situation, how you overcame this obstacle, how you use that experience to grow as an applicant, and how it maybe even makes you a better applicant now that you've overcome this this red flag. And also just it maybe goes without saying, but do not give into any temptation to lie. I mean, if it's found out, it will immediately disqualify you for one. And this application, it's not just to join a department, it's to join a larger scientific community. And really it can only hurt you in the long run. All of these truisms, the only person you're cheating is yourself, that kind of thing. So don't lie. Stephen, if you could go to the next slide.
Absolutely. So, thanks for the heads up.
So just to come back, because we did think that this was a very, very great example of how to deal with a red flag. They use this opportunity, they just took a paragraph. It shouldn't maybe take up any more words than that, because again, you want to focus on your ability as a research student. But all of this was looking forward. They kind of acknowledged the situation, but then went on to explain, okay, well, I overcame this. And now, I'm an awesome applicant with this amazing GPA. And so the final message is, this student is strong-willed, they're resilient, they did not back down from pursuing their scientific career, even though the start was a little bit rough. And at the time of writing, they are a great applicant. And so, if you saw on their transcript that earlier, okay, there was a rough patch, but this is the light that you read it in, it's going to be a lot better than just seeing that low GPA at the beginning and being I wonder what happened there.
Okay, so let's see.
Could I also add one more thing about the GPA? So when you are writing these things, and just so that that's real, you can guess which statement is mine. I think that in the end of that paragraph, that wasn't even like the GPA that was on my transcript. It was the GPA that I essentially calculated from my last few semesters. So there are ways in which you can present your GPA in a way that shows that there is growth and change in the courses that you've taken. So say, for instance, you struggled in your first year of undergrad or whatever, and you decided to continue on and you ended up doing better. They like, I guess what I want to say is that you want to present a sort of trajectory of growth when you're writing your application. And it's okay to sort of emphasize that, for instance, for someone who, again, may not necessarily have a 3.7 or 3.9 GPA, another way to sort of go about it is emphasizing like your last few semesters if you need to in your application. So it's not just about what might be on your transcript, as well as Stephen and Lauren have alluded to in the presentation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Linnell.
Right. Okay, so Lauren, there's a question in the Q&A. If you or Linnell could address that, please.
Yeah.
Yeah, so now I'm going to loop through a few things that you should try to avoid in writing a statement of purpose. So we touched on this earlier, but remember to address the prompt. Always, 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 always make sure that you address the prompts. And so, I said this earlier, but every school might have a slightly different angle that they want your statement of purpose to follow. So be sure to pay close attention to what exactly they're asking for. So again, it could be, right, personal research statement need to be separate, or maybe they ask for strictly research. And so maybe your personal components go into a different box that is like, if you have anything else that you'd like to tell us about your application, please let us know here. So avoiding, just making sure that there's no like sort of like cross contamination of details between different sort of fields on your application might end up being pretty important for at least one or two of the schools that you apply to. And so, of course, everybody knows that typos and spelling errors are to be avoided. It's likely, and I think we can all relate to this, that you're probably going to be writing and rewriting these many times. And something that can happen, like it's very normal, is that your eye gets so like used to reading your own writing and your own like ideas that you might miss, like you kind of start like auto-correcting in your head, and you might like miss awkward phrasing or like a dropped word or an extraneous word that had accidentally crept in over successive rewriting cycles. So one tip that we strongly recommend is to read your statement of purpose backwards. So that is to say, read the last sentence, then read the second to last sentence, then read the third to last sentence. It is so unnatural that it will break up your sort of mental familiarity, and it makes it easier to spot mistakes. And it's also always good to have a trusted friend proofread for you, so to see it with fresh eyes. And also striking a professional and formal tone is also important. So doing your best to avoid sort of like informal conversational language, but at the same time, don't feel like you need to like double back like in the opposite direction and saddle your essay with too many jargon or buzzwordy phrases. It's just about making sure it's sort of like crisp and concise presentation. And so at the end of the day, the statement of purpose is telling your story. So it's important to make sure that as a document, it helps to make you stand out. So what I like to do is I call this like the chop test, so that if we chopped your name off the top of your essay, and we did that for every, for a pile of like 15 essays, would we still be able to identify which one belonged to you? That is to say, are there enough sort of like personal details about what you did? Do you have enough like, who, what, when, where, and why, such that it like makes you distinct and helps to differentiate yourself? Another thing is that it's so critical to attend to the needs of your audience. So the average research professor is probably going to be expecting a document that is a straightforward summary of your research interest and qualification. And so it is okay to have, personal touches or even flourishes in your, writing. At the same time, be very, very cautious that, like artful turns of phrase or like extended metaphors, like don't let them get in the way of the task that the document is meant to accomplish. And for instance, make sure that your essay is very friendly for rereading. So if the professor wants to look back at like one part in particular, that they'll be able to sort of understand how each part stands alone.
Okay, I think we had some very good questions in the chat, and I'm sure Stephen also has some great things to say about it. Again, I think just to keep in mind that the goal is to sell yourself as a researcher going forward. And every detail that you include needs to speak to that. I'll let Stephen maybe write what he thinks. COVID may be easier to address by name because it's, you know, this huge global crisis, but I guess you kind of may want to avoid, like, you don't want to draw attention, I guess, to this horrible situation, but kind of as unfair as that is, but you still need to be focused on, for this particular essay, for how it will affect you as a graduate student in a research group.
Yeah, Alejandra, I think that so when I read the questions that were in the chat, I think it was, I could definitely still see those sorts of events, like affecting like your ability to do well in school in particular. Just to be real about it, a lot of people don't want to have those kinds of conversations, and that includes professors who are reading your statements. I'm just going to be real with you. So unfortunately, we don't live in a society that likes talking about like issues of racism, issues of sexism. We just don't. And it, for the sake of your application, I would advise, like Lauren said, for you to focus on your sort of the things that have affected your research in particular. For instance, in my statement, I could have easily talked about the many like very racist like things that happened when I was an undergrad, including like folks just not wanting to work with me because I was the only Black person in our cohort. But I didn't necessarily do that because I just knew that, you know, the people who are reading are just not going to understand that. You do want to focus on your research, and personally, I wish it was we lived in a different society. But I'm going to be real with you that, you know, some people who are reading it probably won't understand or get it. Just being honest with you.
Yeah, and we'll definitely talk about this more as the workshop continues. Yeah.
In terms of COVID, just know that some schools are waiving their GRE fees or GREs, including Harvard. So they're not requiring the GREs this go around for applications. So I would look into that as well, because some schools are accommodating that.
Yeah.
So we have a few minutes left. We're just going to run through a couple of like other quick points. There are a bunch of cliches that come up in statements of purpose, and you should avoid them, not just because they're like, not because they're bad things to say, but because they just come up so often that it's better to spend your words on other aspects of your experience that will help you stand out more as an applicant. So how proud you would be if you got into this program. I mean, that's great. We're proud too, but you can spend that ink talking about more concrete accomplishments and get it in the first place. Also, there are a lot of essays that start with like, oh, since I was 5, I looked up at the stars and I was like so moved about the vastness of the universe, which I mean, we love that. We've all had that experience, but again, you need to be focused on the goal. How does that inform you as an undergraduate or somebody applying to a graduate program and being ready to hit the ground running with research for your next 5 years? Another thing not to do is you don't want to teach your subject to the admissions committee. That's not what your SOP is about. You don't need to like tell them, oh, and this is how like this pathway works, or like this is how this phenomenon works. I mean, first of all, they may know that, and they probably know that better if they're in your field. It's, again, your goal is to talk about your ability as a researcher and just kind of explaining like, oh, like, you know, this like 2-photon phenomenon, and like, oh, this is how it works. It's not necessarily going to help you.
Mm-hmm. And if you're concerned about if you've gone into enough detail, maybe if you can ask a trusted professor in your field just to be like, hey, like you've been doing this for a couple decades more than I have. Like, is this enough detail? Like, do you understand what's going on? I would think odds are probably like it's easier to err on the side of like maybe saying a little like less about like the textbook facts about what you're doing and more about, remember, keep the focus on you. And also, yeah, this is something I meant to say earlier, but like I statements, like there's stuff that you did, you say like, you know, I did this, I did that, I did, etc. Like own that work, because that is what you, I mean, now that's your contribution. And I understand I understand the impulse to you know want to say things like we, you know, like, oh, we did this summer. It's like, no, you did it. So again, yeah, just I know we said it a few times, but just to emphasize once again, that for the statement of purpose is like kind of your one shot to address, you know, like quote unquote red flags in your application. So of course at this point, you know, remember that to keep it like, you know, in like a positive framing, you can't control certain facts about, you know, your numbers, the numbers on your transcript, or just like the twists and turns of your path to applying to graduate school. But the thing that you can control is the interpretation of those facts in the eyes of your reader. Now's your chance, like, you know, this is your opportunity to put it, like you can control your own narrative here. And so one thing is also definitely don't lie about your research interests if you think it might serve some strategic purpose for securing admission. So for instance, like if you think that it might be easier, like in physics, this might happen, like to get into grad school as like an experimentalist versus like a theoretician. Some departments are on the lookout for it. And another thing is that you know, like there's like areas in physics where like, you know, there's like less chairs available generally, like high energy theory. And there's some people who apply with like everything they've done is like high energy theory, and then they're just like, I want to do biophysics, and like it's not like well substantiated, and I don't know, it just like it, you know, like I mean it's totally, and it is totally normal to change fields once you get to grad school. There's nothing sort of like wrong with that. But just remember that again, the admission is about like a match between the department and you. And so, you know, if you want to make sure that there, you know, a program that is taking you, it would be a good fit for you. And I think just being as upfront about what your sort of like desire to work on, you know, what field, just like be honest about that. And again, just to restate it earlier, just absolutely do not lie under any circumstances whatsoever. Even, I mean, there have been careers of people at any level that have been brought down by lies that just were, you know, thought of like that at the time seemed small and innocuous. And just it's easier just to not do it at all.
So we need to wrap up, but we do need to talk over the next slide.
Yeah.
Because there was this question about imposter syndrome. Revise, get feedback, be aggressive about it. Ask your professors, ask grad students, you know, ask us, and start as soon as you can. And also, very important, work with your letter writers as well.
Yeah.